A millionaire mocked his maid, assuming she was nothing but help. In reality, she held a secret that would silence him forever. It was a morning like any other in the sprawling mansion of Richard Halford, a man whose wealth wasn't just seen, it was performed. He wore it like a costume, flaunting his suits tailored in Europe, his cars gleaming under the sun, and his words sharp with arrogance. To Richard, money wasn't just comfort. It was proof that he was superior, evidence that he deserved to look down on anyone who stood below him. And among those he saw as beneath him was a woman named Mariah, the maid who crept through his marble halls. Mariah was a black woman in her late 30s, her presence barely acknowledged beyond the chores. She carried out. To Richard, she was invisible, a shadow blending into the background. He never wondered who she was beyond the uniform. He never thought about what dreams she carried, what pain she endured, or what strength she quietly held inside. To him, she was just the help. But Richard was about to learn that the people we dismiss the fastest often hold the power to humble us the most. It happened one evening during a gathering of businessmen at his home. The long table was set with crystal glasses and silver cutlery, the conversation flowing with jokes about deals, profits, and the things only the rich believed mattered. Mariah moved quietly around the table, pouring wine, placing plates, and keeping her head bowed, just as she'd been trained to. She was silent, unnoticed. But then Richard, drunk on both whiskey and his own ego, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Gentlemen," he announced, his words slurring slightly. "Watch this." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a letter written in a foreign language, Italian to be precise. It was a contract he had been handed earlier that week, one he had not yet fully understood. But instead of calling his lawyer or translator, Richard had something more sinister in mind. He waved the paper toward Mariah, motioning for her to step closer. "Translate this," he said with a mocking grin, "and my salary, hell, my entire salary this month, is yours." The room erupted in laughter. His friends slapped the table, some shaking their heads at the absurdity of it all. To them, this was comedy, a millionaire challenging his maid with something they assumed was far beyond her capacity. They believed she couldn't possibly read it, let alone translate it. After all, what did a maid know about business contracts or foreign languages? Mariah froze for a moment, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from something else. An anger buried deep, an ache born from years of being dismissed, underestimated, and treated as though her worth was tied only to the broom in her hand. She took the paper slowly. Richard leaned back with a smirk, his gold watch catching the chandelier light. "Go on," he taunted. "Show us what you've got." The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Mariah held the paper, her eyes moving across the words. And then, in a calm and steady voice, she began to read. Not in English, in Italian. Fluent, precise, and without hesitation. The laughter around the table died instantly. Every head turned. Richard's smirk vanished, his jaw hanging open as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. Mariah's voice carried with it not just the translation, but dignity, strength, and defiance. She wasn't just reading the words. She was proving that the assumptions made about her, about who she was and what she was capable of, had been dead wrong all along. When she finished, she placed the paper back on the table gently, her eyes meeting Richard's with a quiet steadiness. For the first time, he couldn't look at her as just the maid. For the first time, he saw her as a woman with knowledge, intelligence, and power he had mocked, but could never truly comprehend. The room stayed silent, the weight of her revelation, pressing down on every man seated there. And in that silence, Richard's arrogance cracked. But this moment wasn't just about a translation. It was about dignity. It was about the truth that lives are buried in the lives of people dismissed because of their skin color, their jobs, their place in a world stacked against them. What Richard hadn't known, what he never cared to ask, was that Mariah had once been a teacher in her home country. She had studied languages in university, fluent in 3 of them, before life forced her into circumstances that led her to his mansion. The maid he mocked for entertainment had once been a scholar, and while Richard had money, she had resilience. While he wore arrogance like armor, she carried wisdom that no amount of wealth could buy. As the men at the table sat in stunned silence, Richard tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out hollow, brittle. The room knew. He had been humbled by the very person he mocked. His own arrogance had staged his downfall. Mariah didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply walked away, leaving behind not just the paper, but a silence that burned into Richard's pride. And deep down, he knew he had been changed, because the truth was undeniable. The woman he dismissed had reminded everyone in that room, including him, that human worth cannot be measured in wealth, and intelligence cannot be disguised by a uniform. Yet this story didn't end in that dining room. That night was just the beginning. What came after, the choices Richard made, the way Mariah carried herself forward, would transform both their lives in ways no one at that table could have foreseen. That night, after the guests left, Richard found himself wandering through the mansion in silence. The laughter and chatter that usually filled his gatherings had evaporated, replaced by a heavy stillness. He replayed the moment in his mind. Mariah's steady voice, her flawless Italian, the way every man at the table had looked at her instead of him. For the first time in years, Richard felt small in his own home. He poured himself another drink, but even the burn of whiskey couldn't chase away the unease. His wealth had shielded him from so much criticism, humility, and failure. But in the space of a few minutes, the woman he'd overlooked had stripped that shield away. And the part that haunted him most, she hadn't even gloated. She hadn't demanded the salary he promised. She simply walked away, carrying with her a dignity he couldn't buy. The following morning, Richard expected Mariah to return to her duties as though nothing had happened. But when she entered the room to tidy up, he found himself unable to look her in the eye. For years, he had spoken to her with dismissiveness, as though she were furniture. Now he saw her in an entirely new light. "Mariah," he said awkwardly, his voice catching in a way it rarely did. Where did you learn Italian?" She paused, folding a cloth in her hands, her face calm but unreadable. "At university," she answered. "I studied languages, Italian, French, English." Richard blinked. "You went to university?" She looked directly at him, her gaze steady. "Yes, I was a teacher back home. But when I came here, my qualifications didn't count. I had to provide for my family. So I took the work I could find." Her words struck him harder than he expected. He had built his life on the belief that money defined value. Yet here stood a woman who had knowledge and education but was forced into servitude because the world made no space for her brilliance. Richard tried to dismiss the tightness in his chest. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "Would you have listened?" she asked softly. And with that, she left the room, leaving him to sit with the question he couldn't answer. Over the next few weeks, something inside Richard began to shift. He found himself watching Mariah with different eyes, not the eyes of a master scrutinizing a servant, but of a man seeing another human being for the first time. She worked with precision, carried herself with quiet pride, and never once asked for sympathy. Meanwhile, whispers of the dinner party had begun to circulate among his business circle. What had been meant as a cruel joke had backfired spectacularly. Some of his associates teased him for being outsmarted by the maid. Others, though, spoke with admiration for Mariah, noting how remarkable it was for someone dismissed as help to display such intelligence. Richard hated the gossip, But more than that, he hated the truth it revealed about himself. He had been blind. One afternoon, unable to shake the weight pressing on him, he sought Mariah out. She was in the garden, trimming roses. "Mariah," he began, his tone more cautious than commanding. "I owe you an apology." She set down the shears and looked at him. "For what exactly? For humiliating you, for mocking you in front of my guests, for assuming," he swallowed, "that you were less than you are." Mariah studied him for a long moment. "Apologies are easy, Mr. Halford. Change is harder." Her words pierced deeper than any insult could, and Richard knew she was right. Over the following months, Richard tried to live differently. It wasn't a transformation that happened overnight. Pride and habit clung to him like a second skin. But slowly he began to shift. He asked Mariah about her life, about her studies. He listened, really listened, for the first time. And in those conversations, he learned truths that humbled him more than wealth ever could. He learned of the barriers Black immigrants faced, how credentials from abroad were often dismissed, how brilliance was silenced, not by lack of talent, but by systemic walls built to keep certain people down. Mariah shared stories of teaching children, back home, of the joy she once found in opening young minds to new languages. But she also spoke of the pain of leaving it all behind, of scrubbing floors in a country where people refused to see her as anything more. Richard felt shame, but also something new, admiration. One evening, sitting in his study, he made a decision. The next morning, he approached Mariah with a proposal. "I want to sponsor you," he said. "There's a program that allows teachers to recertify their credentials here. It's expensive, but I'll cover the cost. You shouldn't be working here. You should be teaching again." Mariah stared at him, stunned. She had expected kindness at best, not opportunity. "Why?" she asked carefully. "Because," Richard said quietly, "it's what you deserve. Because the world should hear your voice, and because—" He paused, his throat tightening. "It's the least I can do after all the years I failed to see you." Tears welled in her eyes, but Mariah stood tall. "If I accept, it won't be charity," she said firmly. "It will be an investment, in dignity, in justice, in what should have been mine all along." Richard nodded. Exactly. The months that followed were transformative. With Richard's sponsorship, Mariah enrolled in the program. She studied tirelessly, her brilliance shining through once again. Richard watched with awe as she excelled, reclaiming the identity the world had stripped from her. Word spread of her journey, and soon others began to take notice. Articles were written about the maid who was really a teacher. Interviews highlighted her resilience. And slowly, society began to see her not as an invisible worker in a mansion, but as the scholar and leader she had always been. As for Richard, he, too, was transformed. He no longer flaunted his wealth as armor. Instead, he began investing in programs that uplifted marginalized voices, funding scholarships for Black students and creating opportunities for those long overlooked. His mansion, once a symbol of arrogance, became a hub for community gatherings where voices like Mariah's were elevated rather than silenced. And through it all, Mariah taught, not just in classrooms, but in life. She taught children languages, yes, but she also taught Richard and everyone who crossed her path a deeper lesson. That dignity cannot be erased, that brilliance cannot be hidden forever, and that those society dismisses often hold the power to change it most profoundly. Years later, when people spoke of Richard Halford, they no longer remembered him only as the millionaire with flashy cars and tailored suits. They remembered him as the man who was humbled by his maid and who chose, at last, to listen. But when they spoke of Mariah, they remembered something greater. They remembered the woman who carried herself with grace in the face of arrogance, who turned humiliation into triumph, and who reminded the world that worth is never measured in wealth or titles, but in resilience, intelligence, and dignity. And perhaps the greatest irony of all? Richard had once promised her his salary for translating a contract. In the end, what Mariah gained was worth far more than money. She reclaimed her identity, she reclaimed her power, and she reclaimed her rightful place in a world that had tried to make her invisible.